Hello everyone, today we talk about the secondary forms of recruitment of the Outremer states, so the Near Eastern Crusader states in the Holy Land, and concentrating especially on the church lands and towns contingents, as well as their sergeant militia and how it was levied, but also about the arrière-ban and the Pilgrims will also join to the Crusaders' military expeditions. I'm using the term secondary because also in here in a kind of a narrow way, because especially these contingents I've listed now are generally overlooked, and objectively we don't even know much about them in actual fact. But there are other kind of secondary sources of troops distinguished from what was the actual bulk of the Crusader forces made up by the feudal contingents. So I'm talking about, for instance, the Frankish mercenaries, or the Syrians, the Maronites, the Turcopoles, the Armenians, and others. Today we're gonna concentrate on this. This is actually the very first video I make on the military organization of the Crusader states. And I know I could have gone by order by starting from the beginning, but incidentally, I decided I wanted to start from the end, and I hope. Naturally, my objective is to talk individually about all these chunks of the whole topic, and even if they're not in order, maybe it's not excessively important. Naturally, we can make a bit of reference to also these other forms of recruitment, because at least generally speaking, you have to think what were the main strategical problems with the management of recruitment in the Crusader states. Probably the greatest problem in absolute terms for the Crusader military was the shortage of heavy cavalry. The Holy Land, Near East, was definitely not like in Europe. It was a different society, also a different environment. And the strategic situation that was naturally highly militarized was a constant. These lines were a constant frontier, indeed. Not that in Europe, the frontiers didn't exist. Also in there, it was a very highly militarized country for the whole Middle Ages. But let's say that this Crusader states had a more evident problem of not having managed to fully export. Actually, the results were rather poor. The Frankish feudalism into the Holy Land, and therefore they had to rely on other sources of recruitment to fight against the Muslims, but also actually, very often they quarreled by themselves. The Byzantines were also a threat, so the thing was much more differentiated than we can imagine, or at least usually than what it is imagined. So, however, this added to the fluidity of the system, and the lack of the traditional backbone of the army. The heavy cavalry was compensated also with these other levies that could prove to be equally important. Also because the Outremer states were kind of this, in fact, feudally, and I would say French feudally dominated area, which means that aside from the usual scanny knowledge we have for these centuries, for such topics, the real problem is also that the feudal elite that ruled these lands was not very didn't flatter very much the rest of the other communities. The feudal elite was extremely elitistic in mind. From a political and social point of view, they thought they were kind of the best guys around. The knight embodied this elite of the population that kind of was meant to rule over the others. So as a consequence, also the attention in feudal Europe towards other contingents, and this happened definitely also in the same Europe, was usually pretty low. And sometimes especially infantry, where fought on foot was considered kind of rubbish practically, and this is kind of even bitter note objectively, and we know of certain by indirect evidence that even in battles where infantry was very likely to have been used, sometimes the sources completely neglected this, and probably also on purpose, because all they wanted to celebrate was the knights and their might and their power and so on. This is naturally a pity from one side, but at the same time it tells us so much about what that society was like. So looking at close at this topic, that, by the way, I'm not excessively expert in, so I'm just collecting this informations, and if there is anyone out there that is kind of more prepared on these specific forms of recruitment, please come out, let's say. And because first of all, talking about feudal contingents, so making a premise on that point, just for telling you how things were a bit different, is that this degree of militarization is revealed by the fact that, unlike in Europe, the feudal contingents were meant to serve the whole year. For instance, you know that in Europe at this point, the sometimes feudal contingents were meant to serve even for like 40 days, and everything was bargained, negotiated, and between the kings, the vassals, and so on. So it was a very complicated thing. Here, it was a sort of, in the Holy Land, it was instead a kind of a metus hostilis, this fear of the surrounding enemy in a situation where objectively there were very few resources, and if this had not been committed regularly and kind of intensively by certain standards, things could get very risky for everybody involved. So in spite, especially if you take, I don't know, the kingdom of Jerusalem, it was a kingdom that, aside from having very interesting and important strategical advantages that were not fully exploited, it did start with a kind of a good, fairly centralized position in political institutional profile, that however went progressively declining, for which even this Holy Land states that had these Outremer states that had a kind of a good potential, a good premise in theory, eventually ended up to be kind of fragmented in power, in the sense that the vassals also in here weren't extremely happy to serve the crown. They had all their own ambitions. They naturally were also expecting in certain cases to become the future kings. There were factions, rivalries, and also many defeats of the Crusaders at this point came at the hand of this essentially this division, this lack in unity of command, and this problem also sometimes also was not related just to these rivalries, actually very often, but also as we've seen, the contingents were usually very small. These lands were not so small instead, and sometimes it was difficult even to organize an army. We've seen it when I discussed the battle of, I created, I think, a Crusader, the Crusades playlist, and it was the prelude to the Battle of Hattin in the same year, in 1187. That is the Battle of and I can't find it. Fantastic. It wasn't. I made actually a video on the Battle of Ramla sometime before, and that's showing the a bit of what that organization was like. Actually, the Battle of Ramla is kind of a functional example of the a Crusader army kind of fighting decently together and carrying out kind of a substantial also unity of command, cohesion, etc. The video I was searching for is the Battle of Cresson. That was kind of it had its strategical significance, because also it brought eventually to the Battle of Hattin. It's not something, and that's a battle to which, aside from the alleged rivalry between the two Crusader leaders at that point were, however, also part of the military monastic orders. But they also there was a problem, as this battle basically was fought before all the contingents had arrived, and there were maybe even in the vicinities. I mean, they were nearby, but learned of the battle when this was already over, and the Crusaders in that case had been defeated. But so several problems that these kingdoms were these powers were trying to cope with by trying to engage more especially the feudal contingents into the military service. So we have listed also these other kind of troops that we'll discuss one point, but here let's talk about church lands and towns, especially the Kingdom of Jerusalem, because these were meant to supply contingents of sergeants. So what were the sergeants? So the sergeant is, or sergeants, obviously, as you want to call them. Here, remember that the dominating language was French in this Crusader states, and these were normally the sergeant was sort of retinue of the knight. These usually followed the knights, and they at this point they could be as well armored as the knights. I mean, at this point, maybe not, but towards the 13th century, there is definitely this waning of the sergeant of this retinue of the knight, who, however, was always considered kind of a lesser status, socially speaking. And in sources, you find this guy's named as milites gregari, so literally the knights who joined in. Which also it's interesting because in here miles is not used specifically as a knight, because when you think of the sergeant, you usually think about not really necessarily light cavalry as we have seen, but something kind of that stemmed from that kind of like an esquire, even if it wasn't really the same thing. It was part of a kind of a they were usually they came from kind of a middle class. They had to join into this expeditions, also not necessarily as proper retinues of the knights, even if that was the norm during time. But as we will see now with these church lands and towns, this could be practically something very different. You just received the fees for occupied the fees for the sergeant service, but weren't quite the same thing. Sometimes you find even the term even more eloquent, milites plebei, or equites levis armature, so respectively the kind of popular knights or plebeian, so knights literally, or here the equites. So here it's important to distinguish milites and equites in the Latin term, because the miles, as we were saying here, is basically the knight, the fighter. I mean, in Latin it originated as a very generic term. It was literally the guy who got paid because he received the hay for the I don't know how to say here, the millet for food. Then eventually during the Middle Ages, at this point, the millet is usually not just the cavalryman, but the heavy mounted elite. At this point, when you in fact instead you read eques, that's kind of a more generic cavalryman. In fact, in here this expression in Latin, equites levis armatura, means basically the cavalryman in light armor. Or you also find it in vernacular like sergent cheval, so servants on horseback, or servientes loricati as well. So this instead stresses, it means armored, cuirassed sergeants and others. So this could really, telling the truth, refer to a very wide variety of troops. Probably from a tactical point of view, they weren't objectively that different. Because naturally there could be the very light cavalrymen that only like runners or scouters and skirmishers and so on, and then we've seen that the heavy cuirassed armored knight as well. But generally speaking, they could kind of blend in. You can imagine the average have been kind of similar independently from their source of recruitment, because that's also the point I'm trying to make today, and I'm also asking you for further explanation. So these terms all refer to sort of mounted men less than a knightly status, including the sergeants, as we've seen, and the servientes in Latin, and they in this case specifically a Frankish mounted sergeant in the Ottoman state, they came, let's say, probably at least and on average from the wealthier burghers of the towns, or any other fief, like ecclesiastical fiefs, for instance, because the church was quite important also in there, naturally. But so these were usually making up the noblemen retinues as cavalrymen. And we know very few about them. There is not always easy to find them in the sources, for instance, also for the reasons I was explaining to you before, because usually the attention was all focused by chroniclers on the knights proper, on the noblemen. But these were always there. That's also how we explained many times on Schwerpunkt, and especially in medieval warfare playlists, explaining that what the also how the knights at this point could not operate on the field without these followers, these squires, these assistants, because they were literally their eyes and ears, and could help them, and they refresh them between a charge and another. Then you can imagine also the environmental factors in here, fighting in summer like it often was in places like Israel, that's pretty tough thing that could happen also in Europe. But there are certain, also the full full year time service is kind of meaningful, because objectively also in the Near East in winter it's not very convenient to campaign, but still these guys had the environmental situation could make them fight for a longer period in the year compared to Europe. Also in Europe there were the differences. Naturally, in Northern Europe usually war started in May. In Southern Europe it was in March, for evident reasons. Here probably even the many battles were fought actually in full summer, but I think preferably also spring and autumn could be more viable than in other, for instance, than in Europe on average. But this is also kind of a general kind of abstract consideration. The important though is that unfortunately we don't know much about them, and there are some certain passages from sources, however, who state us, even when they the sergeants are not named, that for instance, Fulcher of Chartres admits in one passage that those who were not counted as knights, although they were mounted, that had been exceptuated by the previous list. So this is important, because we can see they were there from the sources most of the times, but that's one cases in which we know that they were there. And that's where the kind of the logic starts. Just yesterday I was thinking about the kind of the importance of reading sources, and how you can apply, especially in military history, this kind of military logic, for which even if the sources are lacking a certain information, you can still understand, you can still be relatively sure that in spite of this, there is something else that we can't see, but that had necessarily, or at least very likely, to be there as well. So as we have seen before, also with the term levis armatura, these men were equipped usually less heavily equipped than knights most of the times. There were many ways they could be equipped. Really, at this point, there is no standardization of sort. They might have worn lighter equipment. Also, the environmental factors that I was saying before are very important. There are, I've seen in several places in Europe, I think even in Northern Europe sometimes, certain summers were so hot into which basically the knights preferred to fight without armor, because it would have done more harm than good, paradoxically, compared to protection. So you can imagine once again in the Near East in summer what it was like. And but so this what I'm saying, what I'm suggesting here, that probably the Crusader armies had a much higher quota on average of lighter and probably also unarmored cavalrymen than what existed in Europe on average. And this also for other reasons, also because the certain troops were recruited also with certain tactical specialties that required, in a certain sense, this kind of light equipment. Think about the Turcopoles, that are normally considered to be these poulains, this kind of people, fighters of mixed heritage, between being Turkish fathers and Christian mothers and stuff like that. But among the Turcopoles, actually, they found Frankish, European Franks really came from Europe and learned how to fight on horseback as horse archers. I mean, not really even needing to learn it into the Near East, as actually horse archering was present all over Europe at all times. It wasn't, for certain reasons now we can't explain it, it didn't become a widespread tactics on the field. But if anything, any nobleman went hunting and was perfectly capable of using an arrow from horseback. So also in here there was a lot of adaptability, you can't really categorize and qualify these troops, especially the sergeants, because these could really vary wildly, also probably in tactical need, and that's also what you need in most of war scenarios. I mean, troops that are able to adapt essentially to every kind of situation, and this was all the more necessary when you basically relied as a core of the army on these heavily armored knights that necessarily needed someone else who fought alongside them and kind of paved the road for their deadly charges. So, but for the rest, these sergeants were probably kept like the other knights, wearing maybe lighter or old-fashioned armor, lance, sword, and let's say daggers, and even bows or crossbows. There is nothing strange to see actually at all times at this point someone using crossbow on, even if we don't have on horseback, even if we don't have sometimes extensive evidence of this. This can be just a problem of sources and what they said or what they care to say, not necessarily what it really was like. Unfortunately, what it was like is not something that is given us to know, because probably that's we simply don't have the sources, and there is much iconographic evidence that, for instance, starts in a very late Crusader time, from the mid 13th century, so actually pretty close to the very end of the Ottoman states. But these had always kind of been in there, and what we're concentrating now is what appears to have been a bit of a different nature of the sergeants provided by the church lands and towns of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, because it seems that these were not exactly really the same thing. There were at this point the sergeanty was essentially a sort of class of landholders. They were granted land by the kingdom. The Kingdom of Jerusalem at this point had a very controlled land parcelization and control, that there was much less freedom to dispose of your own fiefs the way you wanted compared to Europe. So that this happened because the monarchy at the beginning in Jerusalem had managed to centralize a little bit into the hands of the state, I would say. Even the church initially had kind of tried to seize these territories and had was put aside So there was nominal, at least, and especially at the beginning, as substantially a strong control of the state over these fiefs, and technically every landholder was obliged to serve in some way, to contribute to the army, which was normal, but this entailed in specifically in Jerusalem this kind of greater also direct participation. So the sense is that everybody who can serve has to do it, because we're freaking out of men, and that was really a big problem. And we see here, especially contemporary chronicles tend to use the word sergeant in variants as kind of blanket terms for all non-knightly soldiers. So what was normally conceived, especially in Europe, as the mounted sergeant is something kind of more very specific, and especially related to a very strongly feudal, strongly related to the feudal organization of the retinues of the knights. Here in the Holy Land was not really so. These were essentially, in Europe, for instance, these were usually half. The sergeantry was half of the size of the knight's fee, for instance. Here it could really vary more. Also, the same knights, by the way, had a bit more of a differentiated kind of source of income. There were many money fiefs in the Holy Land, for instance, not just land fiefs, especially naturally can imagine when these were settlements or even fiefs within a certain city because of trade activities and so on. So the majority of these sergeants were actually very different, diverse types of soldiers, including men that were both mounted or dismounted. So tendentially, yeah, the sergeant was tendentially by tradition, by use, was preferably mounted, but in these cases, really not. Even the Turcopoles, for instance, are often described as sergeants. So this is also interesting because it shows you that there were sometimes and it was normal. There was a Christian knight, maybe with a Muslim squire. That this could happen quite easily. Everything was extremely multi-ethnical, because also consider that the same Near East was quite multi-ethnical in itself. There were so many different communities, as different confessions also within the same Christianity, and so this added also to this mix. The Near East, the Middle East have been always extremely ethnically complex, and not just, you can't say, there's nothing, it wasn't a unitary thing, and this distinction was heavy. So in military affairs that are normally very pragmatic and so problem solving oriented in this sense, it really didn't matter who you were, where you came from, as long as you could participate. In the case of these church lands and towns of the kingdoms, the sergeants seem to have been mostly, in fact, although not really a militia, however, serving rather in exchange for sergeants' fees. And they were probably infantry most of the times. There were naturally also in here mounted sergeants. This is definitely it. But these were preferably going alongside the knights, because they were in that sense a very important resource, for not to subtract to the knights for their assistance. Whereas the rest of the sergeants, however, were kind of this infantry of various ethnicity proper, because there were so many other. You can imagine also in towns where people were locals, who even were surely Muslims also into this, among these sergeants. So this was kind of important, and we have a list that has been made by Jean of Ibelin, who records basically the amount of sergeants of what is believed to have been essentially only the one of the Kingdom of Jerusalem under the reign of Baldwin IV, so between 1174 and 1185, It is this a series of troops that ranges between of contingents that ranges between 25 and 500. So depending on what the property could afford, and that sum up for a total of 5,025 sergeants. And this time consider that we don't have an explicit mention that this was only Jerusalem, but it's quite likely. And if anything, at this point Edessa had already fallen to the Muslims, so maybe it could have maybe referred also to Antioch and Tripoli, that these were kind of principalities that were never part of the kingdom of Jerusalem. That was really the big thing, but they were kind of things on their own based in these other cities that were kind of also historically seat of different powers. So it's not that Jerusalem had the strength to subdue all of these. So sometimes they cooperated. That this list seems to have been exclusively exposing the sergeants of Jerusalem, and we can read it. And also in here, this sergeant service, in fact, as such, so it was a service proper. It wasn't just like the sergeants that were related usually to the knights by some bond of sort for which they followed them, even a sort of as a private thing. And this was the sergeant service was owed, seemingly, in fact, only for church lands and the burgesses of the cities, by the by request of the kingdom. And this list we have is also almost certainly incomplete, and also because we have other because the list of the communities that were to provide these trips is lacking other evidence that we have for other centers that in other years were to provide such sergeantry. For instance, the Magna Maomeria that had to provide 1.65 light armed youths. So they really definitely sound as sergeant. This idea of they were youths, it means they kind of it was normal. The squires usually were young men who were to eventually become to make an apprenticeship essentially in warfare and so on. So even here it's interesting that I don't know now, Magna Maomeria here what was really as a center. I think it was a city, not an ecclesiastical property, but I could be wrong. So also in here it's all the more interesting because even if because ecclesiastical fiefs usually worked not excessively different in different fashion from, at least I believe, from the lay fiefs. But if this is a city, it's interesting that the sergeant service was owed by the youngers, light armed youngers. So this adds also to the idea that this service was owed maybe also for certain tactical reasons. I mean, it was really directed from the above, from the kingdom, this need of having a certain amount of this lighter cavalry also that had to realize. I mean, being young doesn't just mean that you have to learn certain things. It also means you're kind of impetuous and agile and so on. So that's also the best physical condition for light troops that have to move a lot. The heavy knights objectively just have to be steady and strong. So that's also something that a mature, even an old person can be. We know that we're old knights and so on. When it takes to run, when it takes to move a lot, also being young can make the difference, physically speaking. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. Excuse me, here it is. Magna Maomeria is in Gaza. Yeah, I didn't finish the reading. 1170. So that's an example. But I excuse me, I want to Google what Magna Maomeria is because I really, literally have no idea. So let's search for it. Forgive my ignorance, but yeah, this was a new town, and in the southern or village. In fact, this was a center, as I was foreseeing, in southern Palestine, sorry, and 10 miles north of Jerusalem. And today it's called Al-Bire. Excuse me, coughing. So yeah, it's a suburb now. You can see it. So it's interesting that the youngers were meant to serve from there. So looking at this list of Ibelin, I'm just gonna make this list. I'm taking this list from Armies and Enemies of the Crusades, 10, 96, 12, 91, page 115. So just quoting for that. So the patriarch. Oh, this is very interesting because it goes even in a sort of there's all the various differences in the contingents that are interesting to observe. So the patriarch of Jerusalem, 500 Sergian. So this was the biggest guy around, the biggest ecclesiastical fief of the kingdom of Jerusalem. So then he's the one who served with more troops. Then the chapter of the Holy Sepulchre, 500. Although here we have another source in parallel that is Sanudo, which says only 5. So you can understand how these informations sound kind of unreliable by certain standards. But definitely also the chapter of the Holy Sepulchre was very important in terms of some military contribution. So then the Abbey of St. Mary of Jehoshaphat, 150. The Abbey of Mount Sion, Mount Sion, as you say in English, 150. And the Abbey of the Mount of Olives, 50. Although in other 3 versions, these are counted as 150, and it's not listed by Sanudo. Then the Templum Domini, 50. 3 versions say 150, as Sanudo does. So you have this interpolation also that is interesting of the various sources. The Latina, 50. The Bishop of Tiberias, I don't know how you pronounce that. 100, 500 in 2 versions. The Abbey of Mount Tabor, 100, 500 in other 2 versions. The city of Jerusalem. So these are all the major cities. Very interesting. 500. So actually, yeah, there are troops that could field that had to at least to provide on paper as many troops as the Patriarch of Jerusalem. Then the city of Acre, 500 as well. The city of Tyre, 100. The city of Nablus, 300. The city of Caesarea, 50. The Bishop of Bethlehem, 200. Ramla, Mirabel, and Ibelin, 150, while Sanudo says 100. The Bishop of St. George of Lydda, 200. Arsuf, 50. The Bishop of Sebastea, 100. 500 in 2 versions, 150 in another. The Bishop of Acre, 150. 550 in 1 version. The Bishop of Hebron, 50. 550 in another version. The Archbishop of Tyre, 150. The Archbishop of Nazareth, 150. Although it's not listed in other versions, and Sanudo says 50. The Bishop of Sidon, 50. The Archbishop of Caesarea, 50. Not listed in 1 version. Ascalon, 150. 100 in 3 versions and in Sanudo. Jaffa, 100. Not listed in 3 versions nor in Sanudo. Lilion, which Lilion as it's called in Sanudo, 100. Le Gerin, Larium in Sanudo, 25. Haifa, 50. Tiberias 200. So basically, if you make the list according to what Ibelin said, so it's a total of 5,025 Sergian. One version miscounts to 5,175. Calculating all these other versions that we've seen, we get numbers that vary from 4,975, 5,025, 6,125, and 7,025, although other versions total inaccurately, by probably miscalculating, to 7,075. And Sanur instead it totals has a much lower estimate, and all these summed up, and it takes to 4,280. So this is interesting because these are troops that naturally were owed to the kingdom. So not truly. This is kind of theoretical, and it's always like that. I mean, a problem we have in general with the sources from the medieval recruitment is that in every kind of situation is that they are very theoretical. This is what theoretically all had to serve, but definitely given the political fragmentation that existed, or this kind of weak statal control, the actual numbers were usually much lower because certain communities didn't participate, or there were other agreements in special treatments, let's say, that had to do, and this was present all the way. So it's actually very, very complicated to look at what was the effective manpower of a certain medieval entity. Really difficult. But at the same time, when you have data like these, the problem with numbers is, do we have to accept these? Because these are actually all we have. So this is a problem, historically speaking, because do you have to accept it? Do you have to dismiss it? Sometimes, what is important really what the source is telling you. So that even if, especially when there are several sources kind of sticking to the same numbers, even if maybe they heard this information from someone and it's not reliable, and of course this messes up all our comprehension of the world matter, it's still a kind of a meaningful historical, significant historical datum that you have. So you can't dismiss it. You can't say, okay, well, no, this is unreliable, so I don't use it by standards. There are many historians who reason like that. Because even if you know that it's obviously unreliable, it's still a number that is important, talking about ranges. And in fact, people who are not military historians, or they don't even care about much about the art of warfare, the history of military art, if you want, is that they want facts. They want, we have to be sure we have to find a document which exactly says how many, this company, how many troops there were. But and sticking to actually much even more scanty evidence that doesn't tell you about the picture, when you have this kind of incredible documents that tell you, look, these were at least reasoning in terms of thousands of these surgeons, why don't you have to take it as good? Obviously the number can vary wildly, but it's not pure abstraction. It still means something, and you have to understand what that something means together with other sources. So it's kind of important, naturally. Then what else can we say about these? And you can talk about the arrière-ban. So the arrière-ban, that in medieval France was the also in Latin it was arrière-ban, naturally is in French. The Latin is retrobannum. So that's where it comes from. And it was this kind of general levy of the kingdom, for which, by a proclamation, the kingdom summoned to war all of his vassals and their own minor vassals in turn. And this ban was actually, in medieval usage, it's usually meant to be the general levy of the kingdom. This ancient Germanic form of recruitment. It existed partly as such in theory, also in Roman times, but during early medieval times it had been reinforced during the Romano-Germanic kingdoms. So basically, all able-bodied males, ranging certain certain age, usually between 15 to 60, but this also could vary, could be summoned to go to war by the king. Through, they were recruited through the king officials and so on. And the theory also in here is that this ban was kind of rarely used, generally speaking, because the feudal elite now at this point kind of controlled everything. Also these, namely freemen, were almost all serfs at this point, working for them. So it was better for them to stay at home, working the land and providing troops for the elite, for this kind of more, professional. For equipping and training the retinues of the elites that were contained in number, than moving as this massive, shapeless mass of men who had no training, no interest for war, and so on. So this was feudalism back in Europe. But as we've seen in here, there were in the Ultramar states very different needs. So this equated to a also kind of greater commitment that is to be found relatively frequently into these lands. So this arrière-ban, or the levy of all able-bodied freemen, was often summoned to supplement the feudal and mercenary contingents. They were the core of the army. And this could be done on various levels. The arrière-ban usually is conceived as the big levy, but objectively this was also fraction, depending on it was not always a national levy. Sometimes certain cities were to owe this and others weren't, depending on the situation. Also because think about just the logistical resources of moving. Even if it's just footmen, it's still, you have to feed them, you have to protect them in some way. So it's a solid expense. And these medieval times, especially when it took to defend territory and fortified positions, everything could be done fairly easily given the technology of the time, because once you enclosed yourself into a fortress, it took several times usually before someone could storm it. So at that point, strategically, you could deal with that by being informed in time, because news traveled very, very fast in the Middle Ages, contrarily to what was commonly believed. So that the real army, let's say, the feudal contingents, could be summoned, and also with this being mounted troops usually could also had a greater strategical mobility and to relieve the siege from that place. In fact, most of medieval battles and campaigns were actually done were revolving around sieges. Relieving a siege from a certain city. This was the average of medieval times. So I said this because local troops, especially infantry, in this were perfect for the task. It took even a very few men to effectively control a fortress in front of overwhelming numbers of the enemies. And naturally, as you know, the Ottoman states were often under attack from the Muslim powers, chiefly Egypt. Kingdom of Jerusalem, they always try to basically recover these lands there, and putting a bridge head, crossing the Sinai Desert, and having a more direct control on at a close range on Jerusalem itself, hoping to make it fall and to conquer it. So there's a kind of war also of attrition, as you understand, that it's actually a hard form of war. Then eventually the Muslims made it to conquer Jerusalem by wiping out the Crusader army at Aten, but that was also like a shot. But the whole strategical practice was this continuous harassment at the frontiers, seizing this and that thing. In fact, I don't know how many battles have been fought around Ramla because of this strategic crossroads that it represented. I'm saying this because I made a video on the Battle of Ramla, in which I discussed this. Everything I've made on the Crusades is in Medieval Crusade playlist. It's not very hefty. I haven't been talking much about the Crusades and Crusaders, but because I don't know why, they've not been I mean, I like them, of course, and the more I learn about it, I like it. But it's not that I've been particularly interested more than other things. So the arrière-ban here could be levied locally. For instance, like it happened at Jaffa in 1122, at Acre in 1218, and to relieve the siege of Bahrain in 1137. But there were also the full arrière-ban, so on a national scale, especially during these kind of more dramatic events that required a general levy, this condition of emergency, like the siege of Acre in 1104, or for the war against Damascus in 1126, at Ascalon in 1153. And in this last, but also at Montgisard in 1177, and at the same Athens campaign in 1187. At Battle of Athens, there were even 7,000 infantry were recruited there, and they to stop the Ayyubid invasion at that point. So, and infantry was actually very important. The Crusader warfare is really shows actually a lot of interaction of cavalry and infantry. This was very important also because for certain tactical reasons, maybe explained a bit in the video on Battle of Ramla, you have to think really about this. Well, it's kind of silly to say, but I mean to approximate so brutally. But let's just say that obviously infantry was always needed, and cavalry was the dominating element on the field. But still, it required, for instance, to retreat behind the infantry, to refresh, to get new horses, to drink, to change the broken weapons and so on. And at that point, having this screen of spearmen, also kept with crossbows and so on, to repel also the light Muslim cavalry, horse archers, was definitely very, very effective. And in general, in every kind of siege operation, you need infantry. And infantry is vital as an arm because you need to occupy this. Infantry is necessary to occupy a position and to defend it. You can occupy a position with cavalry, but you can't defend a position with cavalry if you don't counterattack. At least infantry has this kind of advantage. And here, also in the moment in which the heavy cavalry was being now really becoming the dominating factor in the battlefield, was still, the intrinsic values of the two arms are kind of pretty self-evident. Talking about pilgrims were present in consistent numbers in many times during crusades, not just in actually in the Holy Land. If you look at so many episodes of later crusades, also the ones against the Ottomans, etc., it was full of pilgrims, and this had always been kind of the case because even before the crusades, pilgrims had always gone to the holy places that were held by the Muslims at that point. It's true that part of the reason why the Crusaders, the Crusades started is that the Turks the Seljuks had taken Jerusalem, and they were also harassing the Christian pilgrims and so on. But generally speaking, it wasn't so dramatic as it sounds. I mean, these communities also were kind of pretty well defended. These episodes contributed actually to strengthen the defense, the guard of these pilgrims. It was full of contractors that could bring you there. Incidentally, that's how the Normans eventually rose in places like southern Italy, because that was their job. You hired as a pilgrim these troops to defend you, and you can imagine naturally that also pilgrims were armed themselves, so they could also join into these events. And naturally there was the kind of the ideological factor involved, for which this part of these people was definitely fueled with many ideals and fate that exalted their own their own also military combat capabilities. Excuse me, there is a little bit. So these were manpower. You guys could be equipped also in relatively poor way. We can't imagine. We don't have to imagine probably this fighting pilgrims as just a guy with a stick, like you find, I don't know, in certain movies and so on. They obviously were equipped for being of some use. Also because if you bring someone with just there with a stick, it's more the cost you have it takes to feed him logistically than the actual effectiveness of that combatant. But naturally, these pilgrims could help in the logistics, like camp aids and so on. So it was full of people who joined. As we've seen, this was a pretty militarized, highly militarized context. So such presence was kind of fine. For instance, at the arrière-ban of Ascalon in 1153, there were certain, together with the arrière-ban, there were also in addition some pilgrims who were hired temporarily and who were to fight in that context. And there is in fact extensive evidence of these troops being paid on other occasions, such as at Ramla in 1102, Senabra in 1113, and the campaign of Ain Yalut in 1183. One interesting point about this is that sometimes these pilgrims were actually coerced into this service. I mean, that were forced to participate even against their own will. And this is important because that gives you an idea of what the main power problems were in that specific context. And this, as I said before, these people were probably also used as kind of labor force more than actually being an actual combat force. But it's present in so many other events. And in fact, when you have to think of a Crusade army, you have to think, like in any other army, so many civilians going there. I mean, every army had kind of merchants, prostitutes, these pilgrims, or people who just had to travel from a place to another. They took this chance of being escorted, walking alongside the army. So sometimes even when we think about numbers that are given by sources, you have to add substantial amounts of non-combatant force most of the times in a bit of all medieval times, but not only. Definitely. And especially when there was heavy cavalry there, you have to imagine lots of camp aids, of carts, of things, that because logistically heavy cavalry is extremely demanding. So many specialists, pioneers, people who were drawn in here from kind of mostly civilian environment as well. I made a video just recently on the military engineering that was developing at this point, with kind of professional figures of masters that guided such such activities, especially the construction of siege engines and so on. The video is called Medieval Military Engineers, 12th, 13th century. That's mostly about Europe, but it does the contribution to European military engineering at this point was coming also from the East. That was definitely well advanced. Now the Europeans were kind of developing in turn their own siege machinery and so on. And the Crusades had brought also this need of a fighting in a relatively urbanized environment that in places like Central or Northern Europe wasn't really pretty much out there. So sometimes, and that's why also, for instance, the Italian city republics were so important, because these were, they provided the ships, the engines, good crossbowmen. So these were the communities from Southern Europe that can always been also more in contact with the Near East, and the Byzantine East, and they knew kind of also more. They were actually on the lead at that point in Europe in military engineering. So there was also this very important combination, and naturally there were so many other, not just tactical but strategical problems. Chiefly the fact that the Holy Land is separated by Europe by the Mediterranean, so you needed also to bring these people by sea. And in fact, one of the other important sources of manpower, although pretty kind of not occasional, but kind of unreliable in many ways, were all these crusading knights that more or less constantly arrived from Europe, to stay there, say, I don't know, maybe just 6 months, because that was the point. I mean, many crusaders actually went to the Holy Land when the Ottoman states were established, just to spend their time, and these were usually serving for, here it's complicated because a crusader knight arriving, leaving Europe to go to the Holy Land was usually not doing it just like out of the blue. There were naturally already certain contexts, certain also political reasons for which, I don't know, the son of a certain noble would go there to serve. These were societies were pretty intensely in communication, but most of the times that was actually the main point, is that most of the crusaders arrived there. They saw what it was. They saw that it wasn't even such a highly profitable enterprise, because also much of the crusader effort was due to the will of getting richer, as in any military expedition. Doesn't matter what was a kind of a religious problem. I think the Crusades were not at all a war of religion, simply because they didn't force to convert anyone in theory. The idea was just to free the holy places from, and to make them freely accessible actually for everyone. The Crusader states were also pretty much tolerant with the Muslims for those time standards. We have to deal with this maybe another in another video, but sometimes Crusaders that arrived there, more than also spending money for getting there and risking life, because you can't imagine what communications were at this time. They arrived there and saw that there wasn't objectively much. They got disappointed in part, and they came back. It was normal. So you had accomplished your thing at the time. You went to the Holy Land. You in this sense, you thought you could have been absolved of your sin. You came back to Europe. You were revered. People Crusaders coming back from the Holy Land of Europe were considered kind of to have this kind of heel of this holy aura that they had gained for some reason, but it was otherwise something very much more, material. We can imagine, and there is this sense of disappointment. Generally speaking, also knowing how the Crusaders history's been there. I mean, at the end, they were naturally these states were reconquered by the Muslims. So and usually these knights would be hired just in the kingdom's army as mercenaries for the time of their stay, for the duration of their stay, normally. And this was kind of an intermittent source of manpower, because you couldn't rely on the single people who came and went back, and there was at all times very great demand of these crusaders in the Holy Land, for which the King of Jerusalem insistently asked to the various principalities in Europe that send us some knights, because here we're really running out of manpower. So it's and there was not a huge enthusiasm after rolling into this thing. So this would open to other many interesting considerations, but for now we'd just like to stop here, because there is sometimes I was wondering, I think I said everything more or less of what I wanted to say, and I will come back definitely on the topic, and we will try to re-expand it in some way. But for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.